Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Belle Jarneski, and on behalf of the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada, I would like to welcome you to our Holocaust and Human Rights Symposium. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that this event is being live streamed from ancestral lands on Treaty 1 territory. The Red River Valley is also the birthplace of the Métis, and our guest speaker, Pinchas Gutter, who I will introduce in a moment, is speaking from Toronto, which is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the William Treaty, signed with the Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Indigenous people have cared for and occupied this land for millennia, stewarding its resources and deriving life and meaning from its abundance. We celebrate their place in our community, their contributions to our collective well-being, and their role in bringing about a hopeful future for us all. We'd like to thank the sponsors of this, our 24th symposium, and of our work throughout the year. The Grossberg Endowment Fund at the Jewish Foundation of Manitoba, the Asper Foundation, and the Azrieli Holocaust Survivor Memoirs Program. This is now actually the 25th year of our symposium, and we are pleased to be reaching students and educators from all over the province. In 2002, the late Elie Wiesel said, "Whoever listens to a witness becomes a witness." Well, today, more than 80 years since the end of World War II, the memory of the Holocaust is under siege through denial, distortion, inversion, and conspiracy theories. In fact, just over a month ago, an all-day summit of Holocaust deniers took place in the United States. Now, you are among the last groups of students who will be fortunate enough to hear a Holocaust survivor speak. And we are counting on you to remember this day throughout your lives and take on the responsibility of being a witness. Now, before I introduce our speaker, a quick word of housekeeping. First, a reminder that this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Please enter any questions you may have in the Q&A box. The chat is not working. We would love it if you would include your name and school, but if you prefer to ask your questions anonymously, that's okay too. So now it is my honor to briefly introduce you to our honored speaker, Pinchas Gutter. Pinchas Gutter is a survivor of 6 German Nazi concentration camps who now lives in Toronto, Canada. He was born in Lodz, Poland, and was 8 years old when the war started. Pinchas, along with his parents and twin sister, fled to Warsaw, where they were confined in the Warsaw Ghetto for 2.5 years. They were captured in April 1943 and deported to Majdanek death camp in occupied Poland. The Nazis murdered Pinchas's father, mother, and sister upon arrival. Pinchas himself was later sent to a succession of camps. He was liberated by the Soviet army from the camp and ghetto in Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia known as Theresienstadt on May 8, 1945. After the war, 13-year-old Pinchas was taken to an orphanage in England. He later lived in France, Israel, Brazil, and South Africa, and eventually settled in Toronto in 1985. Pinchas and his wife Dorothy have 2 daughters and a son. A very active member of the Holocaust survivor community, Pinchas is also one of the pioneers of an innovative project called Dimensions in Testimony, in which a life-sized holographic image allows museum goers, students, and others to have conversational interactions with these eyewitnesses to history and to learn from those who were there. And his project is located at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Pinchas has also been the subject of 3 films: The Void, Political Polish Jew, The Story of Pinchas Gutter, and The Last Goodbye. The latter is a virtual reality experience that allows viewers to travel to the Majdanek concentration camp with Pinchas as he tells them about his early experiences there. The film premiered to high acclaim at the 2017 Tribeca Film Festival and took home the VR Documentary Jury Prize at the 2018 Lumiere Awards. In 2019, Pinchas himself dubbed the virtual reality film into 5 new languages with the intent of bringing the film to global audiences. And so, Pinchas, I am honored to turn over the virtual microphone to you.
Thank you very much, Bill, and good morning to everybody. It's a it's important for me to be there and it's important for you to listen to me. And also, I'm very glad that Bill arranged for this meeting so that I could give you some of a synopsis of my experiences. As Bill told you, I was born in Łódź, Poland, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about the demographics of this city. Łódź was the second largest city in Poland before the war. It still is, I think, and and uh, and there were about 750,000 people living in that city. Warsaw was the capital, and Warsaw had about 1,300,000 and something. But Łódź, it's very important for me to tell you exactly how the population was. There were 100,000 German speaking people who were Polish citizens, like everybody else was Polish citizens. Jews and Muslims and whoever was living in Poland between 1990 and 1939 was a Polish citizen. And so there were 100,000 left over from the times when Poland was divided between the Prussian, the Russian, and the Austro-Hungarian empires. And these were German-speaking people, just like people who came here to Toronto or to Canada, from different countries, and they still keep, their origins, and they speak some of them speak their languages, and those people spoke German. They were very important in Łódź because they brought in the textile industry, and they were very important in the textile industry. Łódź became the second largest city in Europe to make textiles. So now we've got that. I was born into a very Hasidic religious family, and before the war, I was a very happy child. I mean, there was anti-Semitism, I call it Jew hate in Poland, left over from thousands of years, that we have been, persecuted by Christians and others, but I still was Poland, Łódź was a big city, and we didn't feel it as much as everything. My family were winemakers. They were living in Poland for over 400 years, and of course, all of them were citizens of Poland. To come back to demographics, there were about 500,000 Christian people living in Łódź, about 100,000 German speaking or originally from Germany and originally from Prussia and Austria-Hungary, who were speaking both German and Polish citizens, and the rest were Jewish people, about 150, 200,000 people who were approximately, I don't know exactly the figures, but they were quite a large community. And before the war, we had our holidays, we had our Jewish holidays, we had our synagogues, and I can only tell you one experience that I had as far as anti-Semitism, me particularly, and that was when I was very sick with pneumonia, and when I was recovering, I was sent to the Tatra Mountains in Poland. Is a very flat country with lots of forests. At least they were before the war. Now a lot of them have been cut up, but there were a lot of forests before that, and it was flat. But there was one range of mountains between Czechoslovakia then and Poland, and it was called the Tatra Mountains. And I was sent to a place called Shavnica, which was part of these mountains to recover, because when you got pneumonia, especially before the war, before there were antibiotics, your lung get weak. So you try and go to a place where uh, people recover, they drink the waters, and it's supposed to make you feel. And I lived with Gurale, mountain people, in huts with animals. And because my maternal grandparents had a farm in Poland and they were farmers, so I was very, I was very aware of and loved animals. So I loved horses and I loved all kinds of animals, and we lived together with the animals in huts and in tents and so forth and so on. And I was a very happy child there. On Sundays, I used to run down because the local orchestras, the army, the police, the fire brigade, in some schools, they used to come, and there was a place in the garden downstairs in Shavnica, where people used to come and play the music. And on the way back, I used to go past the uh, church. And of course, uh, Poland is a very religious country. Uh, so they had the evening prayers. And I used to stop outside listening to the choir, to the organ, and being kind of very much involved with the music. I loved music. There were no musicians in our family, but I loved always music. And suddenly, um, I started feeling somebody hitting me from the back. And when I looked back to it, there was a middle-aged man, and he started chasing me away and saying, how dare you contaminated the holy earth of our church. And so he chased me away, and it didn't make too much of an instance to me, but I've never forgotten it, because there I was listening to music and choir coming out of a church which was praying, the psalms, and it was the evening prayers on a Sunday in a very religious place. And I was being sent away, and I couldn't understand it. But when I came back home eventually, I was explained that this is, anti-Semitism or Jew hate. And that lasted until 1939, on the 1st of September 1939. And on the 1st of September 1939, the Nazis attacked Poland for no rhyme, for no reason. They actually made a pact with Poland not to attack them, but they did. And within about a week or 10 days, the war was still on. They occupied Łódź. And as soon as they occupied Łódź, the security services came behind them, and immediately they started things they started against everybody, but they particularly started against Jewish people. So we were confined at home. We had a special curfew. We could only go out for a couple of hours during the day. They took away our radios, they took away our bicycles, they took away, if they came into the room, a place, they would take away your jewelry, furs, anything. And then, you remember I told you there were 100,000 people living there who were originally from Germanic speaking countries, and they gave them little lapels with swastikas on it, and they wore them. And as soon as they arrived in Łódź, Jews became non-entities. They took away, for example, if you had a convenience store, or you had a small place where you were a tailor or a shoemaker, they took it all away and they chased you out, and they gave it to the German-speaking people. So everything was taken over, and suddenly every Jew that was living in Łódź found himself unemployed. If you worked for the police, there were quite a lot of Jewish people who worked for the police, Polish police, and for government. and there were rabbis and others, and um, they had lists of notables, and the notables were not only Jewish. They were, for example, Poland had an aristocracy. They didn't call them exactly, like counts and things. They had Polish names for them, uh, and they were on the list because the security services felt that they are going to be a problem later on, so they were arresting them. We lived together with my grandfather in two little apartments on Zachodnia 1954 in Łódź. And there was an interleading door between my parents' bedroom and my grandfather's bedroom. He was 78 years old, and he had just an operation before the war, and he was recovering, lying in bed, very sick. There were two doors to come from the stairs. In other words, to his little apartment and to our little apartment, there were separate doors from the stairs. Suddenly, the war was still raging. Suddenly, there was a ring at my grandfather's door, and my father, opened the interleading door, and I ran after him because nobody was working, everybody was at home, and he opened the door, and there were two security services, which I learned later on, with doc with with the black coats and hats with crossbones and skulls, and the uniform was completely black, and they came in and they asked for my grandfather. My grandfather was a notable because he was a head of an NGO, a non-governmental organization where they taught people to become rabbis. And they were going to take him away. But when they came into the room to the bedroom, and my father told them that he was very sick, that he had an operation, and that he was a very old man, and they decided to leave him because they said he's going to die anyway, so we don't want to take him. And they asked my father, "Who are you? What do you do?" "I am a son," he said, "and I make wine." "Where do you make it?" "Not far, about 10 minutes from here. There's a cellar, and it's called Złote Grono, in Polish, golden grape." And they took him away. They just took him away, took him down to the cellars and beat him up so badly, they even thought that maybe they killed him. So they threw him into a corner, and they told the German army police that as the trucks are going to the front with soldiers, they must come down and help themselves to all the bottles. And they took away the bottles that were down there already for the end of the year. And when they finished taking out all the bottles, they broke the vats, and they took away the wine that was maturing there with jerry cans, and they kind of destroyed something that was there for 70 and something years, and I have records of that, uh, in about 24 to 36 hours. And they left, and of course my father was lying there in the corner, and they didn't pay any attention to him at all. When they arrived, the caretaker of the place, who was a Christian Pole, a friend of my father, saw them taking him down. When they all left, because they had finished, breaking up everything and taking everything out, he didn't see them come out. So he went down to find out what happened to my father. And he found him in a corner. He wasn't dead. He was completely unconscious. So this man risked his life, put him on his shoulder, and carried him all the way, despite there being a curfew for everybody after 6 o'clock. And if they found you walking in the streets, they would sometimes shoot you. So he risked his life in the dark, and he brought him home. And the German-speaking doctor, Dr. Hirschwinkel, I still remember his name, he looked after my father, and after a week, my father became conscious, and he started recovering. The Nazis decided when the war was finished and part of Poland was divided into the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and part of it was German. They decided that Łódź was going to be incorporated into the German Reich. In other words, in Germany proper. And they started making a frontier with the German police standing there and having a kind of complete and thing. And Jews were again. Jews were, they closed our uh, bank accounts, and you could only take out a little bit of money could go buy some food. And as I told you, nobody could work because they took away all the jobs, and things were really getting very, very bad in Łódź. And when my father heard that they were going to incorporate it into Germany proper, into the German Reich, to make Łódź German, and there was going to be a border between the two of them, and the border is going to be watched by police and things like that. He decided that my mother and I had a twin sister. My mother couldn't have children after she gave birth to the two of us. That we were blonde, and we were blonde, blue-eyed. In our family, a lot of us were blonde and blue-eyed, despite the fact that the Germans believe that only Germans' blood creates people with blonde and blue-eyed. But we were blonde and we were blue-eyed. So we passed as Christian because Jews couldn't travel anymore. You couldn't go to parks, you couldn't go to the train station. So my mother and the two children, we went to the rail station. My mother bought tickets, and we went as Christians or maybe Germans. I can't remember exactly how she bought the tickets. And we went to Warsaw because Warsaw was occupied Poland, and my father thought that it would be better. He had a sister who married a man in Warsaw, and because it was occupied Poland, he thought it would be better instead of being incorporated into the Germany proper. So we went by train, and my father, who was cello, he spoke. We spoke pure Polish because, as I told you, my grandfather was a farmer, and we mixed a lot with Polish Christians. My mother always spoke to us in Polish, so we could pass easily as Poles, Christians. So we went by train, and my father couldn't. So he walked at night, and during the day, friendly farmers would keep him in a barn, or if he didn't find a barn, he would go into a forest and cover himself with leaves and sleep during the day, and at night he would walk. It took him a couple of months to arrive in Warsaw. When he arrived in Warsaw, he found we were living with my aunt. And aunt by that time had about 17 people living in her little apartment. And it was very, very crowded. And I slept in the corridor together with another cousin of mine. And it was really very difficult. But when my father arrived in about January of 1940, he luckily at that time he found a little apartment in a Jewish area, Nalewki 94, number 49, which was on the corner of Nalewki and Mila. And it's important to remember Mila because later on I don't talk about it. And we moved out of the apartment. It was a small, really, almost the size of a of like a like a study room with it was divided into two, a small kitchen and a bedroom, which you could only put in two beds for the children and two beds for my parents. You couldn't even put in a wardrobe or anything like that because everything we had was put underneath the beds. It was very small, and Warsaw was no better than Łódź. The same things that happened in Łódź happened in Warsaw. Jews became non-entities. You could do anything you wanted to a Jew. There was a blue police, collaborators with the Germans, a Polish police. Some of them were policemen before the war, and they called them the blue police because they had uniforms that changed their uniforms with a kind of blue color, and they called them the blue police. And if you were robbed in the street and you ran to a policeman, the policeman wouldn't do anything because anybody could stop a Jew in the street, and the Jews in Poland before the war were all religious, so they all had long beards, and you could recognize because they were wearing different clothes also. So everything was easy for the others to recognize who was a Jew. And a lot of German soldiers who were on leave, they weren't even Gestapo or SS, which I learned later on, who were the security services, which I didn't know when they arrived to take my grandfather away. But there they were doing whatever they wanted. And I want to tell you what happened to us when we were still living before my father came. Three people came with black uniforms, and they just walked in. One of them took out a revolver, told us whoever was in the bedroom, it was freezing cold. It was January of 1940, and a lot of the windows were broken. Poland and Warsaw particularly are very cold, colder than Canada. I mean, some places are colder than Canada. Certainly, Warsaw was colder than Toronto. And they told us to undress naked and stand with our hands in the air against the wall in the bedroom and in the corridor. And they said, if you turn around, we're going to shoot you. So can you imagine this little boy who was a religious little boy who never saw females undressed? He saw my aunt, my father had a sister, the oldest one, who was about 50 years old, with her children, and there were 17 people there. All of us had to undress naked. My aunt, my uncle, and all of us. And we stood there. And they took everything of value out in a sack, and they put everything they could find that was of value. And then this guy that took out a revolver, with his same voice, he stood at the door and he said, I'm going to close this door and walk away. And you must wait 5 minutes. If you're going to turn around, I'm going to shoot you. And then he left. So you can imagine what was going on. And there were no ghetto at the time. But on the 1st of October, they decided to have, in 1940, they decided to build a ghetto for 1,350,000 Jews that lived in Warsaw. Now, they were a huge population. No, sorry, 135,000 Jews. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I didn't mean a million. I made them. There were 1,350,000 living all together. So 135,000 were Jews, and they gave us for the ghetto 2.5% of the area of Warsaw. And they stuck everybody in there. And you had to be there by the 1st of November because but on the 1st of November, they closed the gates and the walls with electrified wire on top. I think it was electrified. I can't remember exactly, or maybe it was just wire. There was wire right on top of the walls, and you couldn't get out. You could only go out if you were going to work in German factories who were being established both in the ghetto and outside the ghetto. They established a Jewish community council, a Judenrat. They established Jewish police. There were 2,000 Jewish policemen in the Warsaw Ghetto. They established a prison, a bank, a post office. They made it almost like a independent little municipality, except it wasn't an independent municipality because every day the German SS was to come to the community council and they would tell them for the next few weeks how many slaves they needed to work. First, people worked at recovering the buildings, rebuilding the buildings that were destroyed during the Warsaw War, because Warsaw lasted for a whole month, and then they established many factories in the Warsaw Ghetto and outside the Warsaw Ghetto. So the Jewish police would take people, 30,000, 50,000 of the Jews that were living there, everybody that could work. They were every day, the community council made lists of people that had to come there and work for the Nazis. And they worked also for German factories, German places that were owned by the banks that are still owned to this day. I mean, people like BMW, and factories like BMW, factories like Volkswagen and others were actually working in Poland, and they were owned by the banks that work to this day. Like the Deutsche Bank, the Dresdner Bank, all these people, owned these banks. They owned these factories. And the Warsaw Ghetto was an apocalyptic halt. And I'll give you some. It was an apocalyptic hell. It was so bad that from 1940 onwards, from the end of 1940, beginning of 1941, people started to die from hunger. And the reason why is because our rations were only 180 calories approximately per person. And if you worked and if you had a family and you worked for the German factories, they would give you a bit extra food for the family, but it was never enough to be able to do away with hunger. And because the Christian population, they used to come into the Warsaw Ghetto, they started a black market. And the black market was started by the Nazis themselves. They brought in food and they started selling it. And the Jewish people, first they started selling whatever they had, like jewelry. Then when they didn't have any more left of jewelry, they started selling their clothes. And when they didn't have any more clothes, they started selling their beddings. And then when they started selling their beddings, they started selling everything else that they could find. But people started, because a lot of people didn't have anything, because they started bringing in people from the suburbs of Warsaw, and these people came with nothing. And so they didn't even have anything to sell. So these people started dying. From 1941, people started dying. My father, who was a winemaker and who couldn't do anything except make wine. So already before the Warsaw Ghetto, before there was a Warsaw Ghetto, and my father used to send me out to the restaurants and to the cafes where the Nazis were enjoying themselves, and the blue police and collaborators and Christian people could still go to certain restaurants where the Germans weren't only, there were only German restaurants, and I would stand outside, but at the same time I would collect bottles and take them home. My father would clean them, and he would buy corks on the black market, and he would buy raisins on the black market, and he said little two kind of containers in our little kitchen, and he started making wine. And on Fridays, because Jews who still had money in the Warsaw Ghetto, they make a blessing on Friday night to God over wine. He would give me half a dozen bottles in a rucksack, and I would take them, give me the addresses, and he would give me, and I would go and collect the money for these bottles. And this is how he made a living. And we were reasonably well off because my father could make wine and he could sell it to people who could afford still. And there were quite a lot of people in the Warsaw Ghetto who were collaborators, cooperators, and I don't want to judge them today because it's not right to judge when things are so hoary, when things are so apocalyptic hell. You don't judge people who want to survive. But at the same time, once the ghetto walls were closed, and I would go to Jewish restaurants and Jewish cafes, and they were quite a lot in the Warsaw Ghetto, again, with collaborators, with cooperators, with blue police, Polish Christian police, and German SS and others who were enjoying themselves together with the collaborators who lived in the Warsaw Ghetto. And so there were quite a lot of restaurants and places where they enjoyed themselves. And I would stand outside at the same time as I went to collect bottles for my father, and I would watch them, dancing and drinking and all kinds of things, doing them, enjoying themselves. And at the same time, in Poland, turkeys are not used, but geese and ducks are very important in Poland. So geese and ducks were being roasted, and the scent of this roasting came out. And of course, I never touched anything like that because we didn't have any. All that we had at home, the most that we had is some vegetables, potatoes and bread. And my mother used to cook some broth, which she made some from carrots and other things that they could buy on the black market, and she would cook, and to be quite honest, my father made sure that I was never hungry, and my sister, who never left my mother's skirts because she was scared to be outside. But I always used to run in the ghetto. And as 41 went on, more and more people died in the Warsaw Ghetto. And today, if you go to the Jewish cemetery in Poland, in Warsaw particularly, they dug a huge pit, and the Jewish Community Council had a cemetery organization. They used to go around with wooden carts, and they would collect the bodies from the street, and they would throw them in without any prayers, without anything. They would just throw them into this pit. And then some of them were dressed, some of them were naked, because people used to take their clothes off to try and sell it to the Christian people that used to come so they could get themselves some extra food. And this went on, and it was worse and worse and worse. And as I told you, if you go today and you go to where the pit was, there's a monument on top of it, and about 80,000 to 100,000 people died in the Warsaw Ghetto out of about 100 about three. I'm getting really confused nowadays. There were about 335,000 people in the Warsaw Ghetto, and towards the end, they were close to about 500,000 because they brought people from everywhere else. So out of this 335,000 or 500,000 people, and I'm not sure about the statistic of it, but this is what is in the literature when you read about Warsaw Ghetto, that there were about towards the end there were about 350 to 500,000 people living in the Warsaw Ghetto, and a lot of them, of course, didn't have where to live, so they lived in the streets. They lived, tent to a room. They lived in cellars. They lived in halls and synagogues. The community council opened up everything, and they tried to accommodate people. Like my father used to bring people. We were at such a small place that the caretaker wouldn't even put people in our apartment. But at night, people used to come and sleep in our little kitchen. And this went on until 1942. In July, on the 22nd of July of 1942, actually on the 21st, placards appeared on the walls, and they said because of unemployment, because of hunger, because of disease, because things are quite bad in the Warsaw Ghetto, we are going to relocate you. They didn't use the word deport or send away. They just said relocate you to the east, where you're going to find jobs and you're going to work on farms and you're going to be much better off. So what they've done is they actually offered 3 kilo bread for people that come to the rail station where there were kind of cattle trucks, and they took them away. People went voluntarily as volunteers because they gave them 3 kilo breads. People were hungry. They gave them marmalade for the journey. They allowed them to take 15 kilos for each person, including the children, and families go together. And everybody thought that this is a much better place to go. But within weeks, we learned, and I'm not going to go into it how we learned it, but it was because some people that were chosen at the end to be still workers, to help them murder people, they went about an hour and a half or 2 hours from Warsaw to a place called Treblinka. When they arrived, they saw Red Cross flags and men in white coats with megaphones saying this is a place, a place for you are all dirty and you're going to be cleaned and you be cleansed, and if you got shoes with shoelaces, please tie them together, keep your clothes together and everything, and then you are going to disinfect you. You're going to continue the journey afterwards. The only thing that actually happened was they didn't continue. They went afterwards. They were told to undress naked and then to put the clothes away, and then they were taken to a place where they were murdered. So of course, people stopped going voluntarily because everybody started knowing that this is a place where they're taking you to be murdered. The people in the Warsaw Ghetto are going to be murdered. And my father never trusted the Nazis, despite the fact that he had documents, because what they were doing is they were playing games. So they issued documents to those people because not everybody was going to be so-called relocated. So what they did is they issued documents, and the documents were saying that people that are working for the Germans, they are not going to be relocated or murdered. And so they issued red documents, yellow documents, all different color documents. And then when people didn't come to the station because they didn't want to be murdered, they played the games and they changed the documents all the time. So they would surround a couple of streets and they would tell everybody to come down to document inspection. And when people came down with the documents saying that they could officially being because they were working and stuff like that, they said those documents are not valid. They would take them away. And this went on until the end of 1942 in September. And they had like actions, different actions. There were lulls in between different actions. And at the end of September, it stopped for a while. And then my father, who didn't trust them, when people started realizing that everybody except those people, possibly the ones that are working in German factories, are not going to be murdered, they started building bunkers. And our building, in front of the front of our building during the bombardment of Warsaw in 1939, the front was destroyed. So there were ruins. So under these ruins, they dug a deep cellar, like a mine, underneath the ruins. And they brought in air, vents. The vents were put camouflaged in the ruins, and they put water in and electricity, and they made it quite, it was quite a reasonable place where you could hide. So there were lots of bunkers being built in the Warsaw Ghetto after Warsaw, after September 1942. Then they came in January 1943, they came to take some more people away. By that time, nobody was going, and the resistance started already to resist with arms, and they started shooting at Germans. So the Germans stopped after taking out about 7,000 people. They stopped and they left us alone, and there were about 40,000 Jewish people working for the German factories officially, and they were what they called them wild people, and we were part of those wild people that were unofficially in the Warsaw Ghetto, another 40,000 people. So altogether, there were about 70,000 people in the Warsaw Ghetto left over by the time the 19th of April 1943, when the uprising started, when the Nazis came to take the rest of the people away and the factory is going to be relocated to some other place, they came, but they were met with resistance. And the resistance lasted for about 4 to 5 weeks. We were hidden in the bunker for about 3 weeks. They went from building to building, and they said, if you don't come out in half an hour, we're going to burn the building down. They were bombarding, destroying the buildings, and they were firebombing the buildings if you didn't come out. And people started coming out, which they were taking them to Treblinka to be murdered. We were taken out after the uprising started, and we were in the bunker, as I told you, for 3 weeks. So it was the first week of May. We were chased into the Umschlagplatz, the place of where they took you away, and we were there for about 36 hours. We were in a room where they kept you without giving you any food, without giving you any water, and they pushed as many people as you could inside. And there were women, pregnant women, women with babies, women with children, families, old men, younger men, as many people as they could, they pushed them in. You couldn't even lie down. You could only either stand or kneel. My father, who, was always guarding his family, he noticed that if you go to the guard at the door, these were like schoolrooms, because this was an old Jewish school where they kept us. And if you go to the door and you give them some jewelry, so he took off my mother's ring from her wedding ring, and he went to the door and he saved, and he gave him a big bottle of water, and he saved a sock with sugar, and he had a teaspoon, and he would give his children, my sister and I, a teaspoon of sugar and some water from time to time. They never touched it. And then after we were there for quite a long time, as I told you about, we were there the whole day, the whole night, and most of the following day. And then they chased us into the wagons. So you can imagine what happened. And when they didn't allow anybody to come, what kind of a place you had to do all your ablutions, everything. So they didn't let you allow. They didn't give you any food. It was, there were people who were screaming, people were dying in the room. It was worse than hell. And eventually we went into the kettle trucks, and my father saw the little room, the little window with barbed wire, just like the barbed wire that was on the top of the walls of the Warsaw Ghetto. And he pushed us towards the barbed wire because they again pushed as many people as possible into the kettle truck, because that we should be able to breathe. Because he felt maybe we will survive. I mean, we were going to take him to Treblinka, except in our case, we went to a place, I don't remember how long we drove, how long the train took, but we were there for a couple of days, and then we arrived in a place called Lublin. And Lublin was a place where there were, next to the city, there were 5 concentration camps divided by barbed wire, electrified barbed wire. And there were 5 camps next to the city itself. Usually these concentration camps were hidden in forests and things like that. But this was very near the city. And there was a camp for Polish prisoners of war, Jewish prisoners of war, Russian prisoners of war, and different camps. And camp number 4 was for Jews. And camp number 5 was for mixed Jewish and Christian and any kind of people that were opposed to the German rule. From the underground, they were, the women was in camp 5. So these were called 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which means 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different camps divided by barbed wire, electrified barbed wire. When we arrived in Lublin, they walked us to a place where we saw this camp, not far from the train station, and we were being separated. So men from women, women with children, women on their own, children on their own. My sister was separated from my mother, so she was pushed into with children, and suddenly I was watching my mother standing with the women, and suddenly I saw my sister. She must have spied my mother, so she went and she ran, started running. She had a long braid, a blonde braid, and since that time, we were 10 years old at the time, and for 10 years we lived together. We were born together, and we played together. We did everything together. And I forgot everything except her blonde braid. When I think of my twin sister, Sabina, all I remember nowadays is her braid. The blonde braid that kind of was at the back, because she hugged my mother when she rushed towards her, and I was watching the blonde braid, and since then my brain has done away with any memory of my sister. I have a photographic memory. I remember everybody, cousins and uncles and great uncles, and quite a lot of people in my family, all my father's sisters and uncles, and I can't remember my twin sister. My father must have known something. So he told me that when they ask you, say that you are 5 years older, that you are 16. And I was a head taller than my twin sister. So he took me with the men, and I was pushed together with my father towards standing with the men. And then when everybody was taken away first, we stood there until everybody was taken away. And the men, I mean, the women, the children, everybody was taken away. And we were then walked into a barrack, and they told us to undress naked and stand with our hands in the air. And of course, I thought we were going to die because this is what they do. They tell us to undress and they take our clothes away and then they murder us. So there was a man with a white coat with a stick, and maybe he was a doctor, and he was pushing people right, left, right, left, right, left. And he pushed me to the right, and my father was running in front of me, and he disappeared. So I kind of came in and I saw shower heads. And when I saw the shower heads in the Warsaw Ghetto, with you, they try to fool you right to the end so that you should think that you're going to be disinfected and washed and disinfected. But in my case, water came out. So I I was washed and then I was pushed into a barrack, given prison clothes, a striped round hat and wooden clogs, and I was chased out on a roll call. And I thought, if I'm alive, my parents must be alive. But I looked around and I couldn't find my father. So I thought, well, he's somewhere else. But I will find him eventually, and my mother and my twin sister also there, because this is a place where they don't kill you. They kind of, they treat you as workers, and you're going to be a slave worker. But a day or two later, I found out if you went to the left, you went to a guest chamber. And if you go to Majdanek today, you can see that the guest chambers are next to the place where I went to have a shower. And because the Nazis didn't have time to destroy the guest chambers like they did when the Russians came to Auschwitz. So they didn't have time to destroy the guest chambers, and the guest chambers stayed there. So if you go to the left, you can see the guest chambers, and if you go to the right, you can see where people went as slave workers. I was in that camp for 3 months. And then after 3 months of terrible slavery, I was sent to another 4, 5 concentration camps. So I went first to a labor camp, so-called labor camp, where they used to kill you with work or making munitions and acids and stuff like that in a place called Skarżysko, built by the Polish government before the war. And then they continued. The Germans took it over. It was in forests, and you started making mines, artillery, hand grenades, all kinds of munitions, and you worked with these acids. You had no clothes like the Nazis and the Polish workers that used to come from the villages and the towns around it to work on a daily basis. They were wearing, like the fire brigade, they were wearing clothes with masks. We had no mask. We had nothing. We were just wearing our clothes. And so people used to die. Fortunately for me, I was, the internal camp was looked after like a ghetto by the Polish. There was a Jewish police, and there was guards around. Some of them were Polish, but the majority were guards, factory guards. But they had guns, they had machine guns and rifles, and they were guarding the camp. And I lasted there for a whole year because the Jewish policeman that looked after me, that I belonged to his group to work, he took me to work in the open air. So I wasn't affected by all these chemicals that went through your body. And and you only could last. A cousin of mine came from Łódź to this camp, and he lasted only 3 months. After 3 months working with the chemicals, he died. So this is a factory of death. A man who survived that factory, and he wrote a book after the war. He called it "In the Fabriken von Tod," in the factories of death, because if you couldn't work anymore, there were selections, and they would take you to the forest and kill you. I lasted there for a year, and the policeman Katz saved my life on 2 occasions. Once when I had typhoid, and then second time when the camps was being liquidated and there were selections, and I will stop here because time is running out. So I was sent to a place called Częstochowa after they liquidated the camp, and I was chosen to die, but Katz saved my life. And then I I was sent to Buchenwald, another terrible camp, towards the end, kind of towards, uh, I think, October, November of 1944. And then I was sent to a place called Kolditz. And then I went from Kolditz on a death march from Kolditz to Theresienstadt. And on the 8th of May 1945, I was liberated by the Russian army. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Pinchas. I have some questions. Now, I do apologize. I don't know what is happening with Zoom. Apparently, many people are not able to access the Q&A, but there are many questions that were sent to us ahead of time. And so I will ask you those that you haven't already answered. These questions come from students at Roseau River School and their teacher, Megan O'Hare. What was the passage of time like during your time at the camp? In other words, did seconds feel like days, or did they all run together?
Well, they gave you occasionally, depending on which camp you were, usually on Sundays, you were given at least half a day where you didn't have to work at all. And sometimes in Skaržisko on Sundays, because the guards didn't want to work, and the SS and the other people didn't want to work, the Christian people that used to come. So Sundays you didn't work, but normally you worked from dawn to dusk. In other words, there were two terms. So you worked 12 hours. As soon as at dawn they woke you up, they gave you some kind of black coffee, which they made from acorns or whatever, and it was like hot water, and you went to work. And then lunchtime, if you were lucky, you got a bowl of soup, and then depending on where you were, you might have, if you were in Częstochowa, where you worked very hard with steel, then you also got a piece of bread, and the food was much better. But basically, um, they tried to, depending on which camp you were. For example, in Skaržisko, the camp where I was first for a year, and where Katz, the Jewish policeman, saved my life twice. I mean, they used to have selections all the time, and if you couldn't work, you were killed. And in Częstochowa, there were no killings. There were no Germans inside the camp itself. The men that run the camp, Frankel, if I remember his name correctly, the Jewish kind of chief of the camp, because the inside of the camp was always organized by Jewish police and Jewish camp guards. He arranged not to see Germans inside the camp. So there were no killings. Nobody died in that camp that I remember. Only one person came near the wire, and he was shot because he came near the wire, and the guys that were guarding the wires, they shot him because he came too near. So basically, your existence in Buchenwald, in Buchenwald, there was no food. It was towards the end of the war, and it, there was actually people used to start cutting up dead bodies to eat. You know, it was terrible, and it really it depends on which camp you were, but different things happened in different camps.
Pinchas, can you tell us a little more about the story when you were liberated, and where you went when at liberation from Theresienstadt? I know that you have an interesting story there, and then how you got to the orphanage in England.
Well, what actually happened was that I wasn't. We arrived in Theresienstadt about 2 or 3 weeks before we were liberated. When we were liberated, and we said everybody started shouting, "We are free! We are free!" So because I had worked in the SS kitchen for 3 months before the death march, I was reasonably well off from the point of view of being able to be a human being. So I ran out to see what was going on. And the Czechs and the Russians were chasing out the Germans who had settled by Hitler, Yamachshamo, in Moravia and Moravia, uh, because he tried to resettle places for Germans only. Now they were being chased out. So there were women and prams and little children, and I felt sorry for them. I really felt sorry because I saw them suffering. The Russian and the Czechs were hitting them, beating them. They were old men. There were very few younger men, even youngsters, because most of them were taken to the army in the last weeks or the months of the war. So you only saw these people being beaten and done things to them. But I saw a couple of horses with a wagon standing in a forest. And because of my familiarity with horses, which I loved horses, particularly the smell, I loved my grandfather's horses on his farm. I used to love their scent and I used to play with the horses. So I ran towards the horses and I started cuddling them and I started kissing them and doing all kind of things. And I waited because I thought it belonged to somebody. And I waited and I waited and I played and I waited. And then after an hour, I thought to myself, well, they were abandoned and nobody's there. So I decided that I got onto the wagon, I took the whip, I didn't hit the horses because you only have to show them the whip. I took the reins and I told them in Polish, Vio, which is very close to Czech, and they went left and they went right, and I could drive them. So I drove them all the way into Dresdenstadt. And then I became a contractor to the Russian and the Czech government, and I became an employee, and they gave me 5,000 korunas a month. And so I became a contractor, doing all kinds of contracting work. Then after 3 months, they decided, UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, decided UNRWA to take us to Britain. So we went with the British aeroplanes, with the Royal Air Force, to Westmoreland, the Lake District, to a place called Troutbeck Bridge, where during the war they had a place for training uh, officers. And it was the first place where I had a room of my own with a proper bed and proper bedding and so forth and so on. And that's where we spent 3 or 4 months, I can't remember exactly how long, being rehabilitated. And that's where I learned my English.
And from there, you went to a number of other countries. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how you managed to get there? What
Well,
brought you to the various
well, this
countries?
is a long story because I never wanted to be looked after by charities. So they called them hostels. But in actual fact, these hostels were actually not real hostels.
They're like orphanages.
Yeah, they were Jewish hostels, and I was sent because a rabbi knew that I came from a religious family in Troutbeck Bridge. So when they sent us out, I was sent to London to be in a yeshiva for 9 months. I was in a yeshiva. But these were really orphanages. These were not hostels, and they treated you like no, but like bad. For example, when my trousers got torn and I wanted a new pair of trousers, they said no, it's going to be fixed up. And I walked around with trousers, with ladders, with pieces. And so I ran away. I ran away after 9 months. And I wanted to cut a long story short, I wanted to be independent. Didn't want to be on charity. So I started working as a apprentice motor mechanic for Ford in Dagenham, in a place called Dagenham. And after about a couple of months, they found that my lungs couldn't take all the different oils and stuff, so I became an apprentice frame maker for lenses. And then a cousin of mine who survived the war with his wife and children hidden by Polish Christian, people who say risk their life to hide them. They actually ran away from Poland because things in Poland started not being very good in certainly a couple of months after the end of the war. So they ran away first to Czechoslovakia, and when Czechoslovakia became communist, they ran away to France, and they started a little textile. And in 1948, they found me. So in 1948, I was living with a Jewish family as a boarder. I was working. I was quite happy. I had friends. I slept together with Victor, who was more or less my age, and with the Diamond family. They adopted me almost like a child. I paid them every week. I used to get paid weekly. So I used to give Mrs. £3.10 weekly. I used to give Mrs. Diamond £3 and so forth, so on. So they persuaded me, my cousins, that I should come and visit them in Paris. And when I came in Paris, they made it so that I stayed. And I stayed with them for 3 years. And after 3 years, when I became 18 and I could do what I wanted, I wasn't dependent on anybody else because I was now regarded as my own person. I decided to volunteer and go for the Israeli army. And because I never been to school, I couldn't become an officer, so I became a sergeant, and I was there in Israel for about 5 years. And then I met my wife in Jerusalem, where I decided to start studying to become somebody. But the fact was, my money ran out from work. I saved money, but it ran out. So I said to start working again. So I started working and I never went to school, but I educated myself to a certain extent. Then I went back to England and we stayed in England. My eldest daughter was born there. And then I was looking for work. My money ran out again. So I found work in Brazil. And I always looked for work. I didn't want to go to South Africa. My wife was a South African, and I didn't want to go to South Africa because of apartheid, because of racialism. And I wasn't prepared to go to a place where there was racial inferiority. So I went to Brazil, where there was racial inferiority, unfortunately, and I found, unfortunately, that there was. And then we became pregnant with our second child, and then Dorothy had to go back to South Africa because we didn't want to live in Brazil because Brazil was no better than South Africa. And then I never wanted to live in South Africa. So after working and being there for many years, and then eventually I looked for a place where I wanted to settle down, where it was free. And by chance, I was sent this place I worked for. They used to send me all over the place. So I went to the United States. On the way back, I went to Canada because my uh, my wife's brother was living in Canada. He went to Canada in 1967 or 66. And so I visited them. And when I came to Canada, I felt that the air was free here. When I walked in the streets of Canada, to me, it was breathing free air. And everybody was together, black people, white people. It made no difference. All kinds of people were mixing up. And I said, this is the place where I want to finish my days. And I'm very happy that I came here.
I, with everything that has been going on of late and the rise in anti-Semitism, how would you contrast life in Canada today with the Canada that you found when you first immigrated here?
Well, I immigrated here 40 years ago. 40 years ago, Canada was like a blessed place. Everybody was very polite, everybody was very nice. And despite the fact that Toronto is, I would still, I'm an optimist. So I still regard Toronto, despite the fact that last weekend, we had two synagogues being shot at, or
Free.
three synagogues, and we've had previous things, and there've been all kinds of anti-Semitic, or I call them Jew hate things going on, and things are not really things are not really very nice, and but the government here, the Ontario government, the Toronto police are very conscious of it, and they're trying very hard to do things to make a better place for everybody. And I think the government of Canada is concerned about the Jew hate and the anti-Semitism, what is being called by some people. And the Jewish community also is not burying its head in the sand like they did in Poland before the war. So we are standing there defending ourselves. There are people going, and I say things, and people come from different newspapers, and they interview me, and they interview other Holocaust survivors, and uh, things are not very good. I mean, the fact that my grandson had to come to me actually a year ago already, when things were getting worse, that he says to me, what's this going on with anti-Semitism? He says he never knew anti-Semitism, and he was 30 something years old. My grandson, who came here when he was a year, he was a baby when he came to Canada.
Mhm.
He was 6 months old, and he'd never seen anti-Semitism in his life. He went to school and he went to university, and everything was okay. And he came to me to explain to him what is this going on, what is happening. So I am concerned. I've got great grandchildren now, and I'm concerned that for them things are not going to be the same as they were for me and even for my grandchildren. So, I am concerned, very much concerned. And I'm
As I am.
desolated, actually, when I watch the scenes on what's happening all over the world, what's happening in the Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Israel, what's happening in everywhere, what is going on, where the world is completely upside down. I mean, it's not the same world now that used to be,
Mhm.
even 20, 30 years ago. I mean, after the war, I felt that that's the end of iniquity. that iniquity is going to finish because of such terrible things that happened. Everybody has learned how to behave properly and how to live as a human being. But it didn't happen. There's always these terrible individuals like Hitler, like Putin, like others
So
who
we
rise
we
up.
have we have today about 2,500 young people and their teachers listening to your important story. What message do you have for them? A lot of times I hear young people and adults saying, what can we do? We should have learned, as you just said, we should have learned something from this history. What is your message to them?
I have a very simple message. My simple message is as follows. I give them a present. My present is like a torch of Olympic torch. The Olympic torch has got one flame, and when they finish one Olympics, they run from to all the towns and cities of the people that are going to the countries that are going to have the Olympics next, and they run and they want to create goodwill between athletes. So the goodwill should be there, and they shouldn't fight. They should compete properly, and they should be, hunky dory. Everything should be nice, and everything should be wonderful. My torch is a talk of graciousness. It's a talk of righteousness. It's a torch that has got lots of flames. And I want to just give you the first 5 flames. No racial discrimination, no religious discrimination, no homophobia, no xenophobia, and above all, most important, no hate. Hate is vicious. Hate is pernicious. Hate creates vengeance. It creates terrible things about people that people want to take a part of. So I want to give you these torches. Take them. Take those torches with the flames. Give them to your friends, to your family, to everybody that you can. Each one of you, I'm giving you a present, a torch which I carry all the time. And let those flames in those torches light up the world and make it a better place for all humanity. It doesn't matter whether you are a Christian or you're a Muslim, or you're a Jew, or if you are a Mohammedan, or if you are a Burmese, or if you are whatever you are. It doesn't matter what religion. It doesn't matter who you are. You are a human being. There's only one creator. As far as I'm concerned, I'm a religious person. There's only one creator. He gave us free will, and we should use our free will to make the world a better place. Use those flames, make the world shine a better place. Thank you.
Pinchas, I cannot think of a more powerful and important message that you have given us today. And I thank you so much on behalf of everyone that has been here. This has been recorded, so we will also be putting it on YouTube. I hope that everyone here remembers your words, your story, and the message that you have left with them and take it to heart. And I thank you so much for this. And I thank all of the students and teachers for being here today. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye bye.